Hello everyone and welcome back to The Lost Planeswalker, and you're here with me, Jesse, the Lost Planeswalker, and today I'm doing Hylda of the Icy Crown. This is a super cool commander from the Wild of Eldraines that cares about tapping untapped creatures your opponents control. While I was designing this deck, I found that it was actually quite cheap to build this deck. A lot of the tap spells that we're going to see are really inexpensive, so I tried to do this budget-wise, which I don't normally do, but this deck, according to TCG Player, comes in right at $34.21. And let's see Hylda of the Icy Crown, 2 white-blue, legendary creature, human warlock. Whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, you may pay 1. When you do, choose 1. Create a 4/4 white and blue elemental creature token, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, or scry 2 and draw a card. Hylda is kind of the perfect package, and let me explain why. You use your spells to activate her ability, and you can pay 1 to create creatures, which is super great. And it's not just some like little 1/1 creature, it's a 4/4 white and blue elemental, so that's actually a decent size. 2, she lets you put counters on all of your creatures for 1 mana, which is incredibly powerful, and it can scale drastically. If you tap 5 creatures and pay 5 mana, everything gets +5/+5 permanently. That's not till end of turn, that's not during combat, that is permanent. So if you create 5 white and blue elementals and then pump each of them 5, they're 9/9s, which is really, really good. And she also scries 2 and lets you draw a card if that's what you want to do. Meaning if your hand isn't looking too great, or if you need to filter through some cards, this is super easy. A lot of decks get stuck where maybe they cast a Ponder or Brainstorm and they can put the cards back on the top of their library, but that's not what they want. You know, they want to get rid of them. She lets you put them right on the bottom by using her ability and then lets you draw a card. So Hylda is one of the most popular commanders, and I think as the set continues, more and more people are going to figure that out. So let's dive right in and look at the land base real quick. I made this super simple. I added islands, plains, myriad landscape, prairie stream, reliquary tower, and command tower. I did not go into depth about building the land base in this deck because I was wanting to more focus on all the different tap abilities, and really, if you want to build this budget, there's a lot of great lands that are super cheap, but unfortunately a lot of them enter the battlefield tapped, and you're really going to put yourself behind. So having a little bit of fixing is going to be good, and then just stick to some plains and islands. Most of this deck doesn't rely on a lot of multi-mana pip spells, so you're really not going to be hurting for, having 4 blue mana for something. Now, there's only 3 categories I divided the cards up into for this deck. The first one we're going to be looking at is chosen to tap. And what I mean by that is you get to choose when a creature is tapped. It's not an activated ability or an ability of something happening. This is just your choice. Like, yep, I want to tap that creature. So starting off, we have Ballynock, Trapper, Buster Squall, and Bond of Discipline. Ballynock Trapper is just tap a creature, and whenever you play a white spell, you can untap it. That sounds pretty good to me because we're going to be casting a lot of white spells, so this is going to be super helpful. Buster Squall is just a single mana or overload, which says tap target creature you don't control. So if you overload it, you replace target with each. So for 4 mana, you just tap everybody's creatures, and then you just put whatever mana you have left into getting stuff from Hylda, which seems really great. And similarly, Bond of Discipline taps all creatures your opponents control and then gives all of yours lifelink. With her ability, you can easily make a board of 30 power in no time, and giving them all lifelink will just help you stay in the game. Cone of Cold, Downpour, and Ensnare are next. Cone of Cold is pretty great because it's one of those dice rolling cards from Battle of Baldur's Gate, and the real upside is just if you roll higher than a 10. First, you tap all creatures your opponents control. 1 through 9, really great. 10 through 19, tap all creatures your opponents control. Those creatures don't untap during the controller's next untap step. Even better for us, keeps them tapped down, lets us get ahead. If we roll a 20, tap all creatures your opponents control. Those creatures don't untap during the controller's next untap step until your next turn. Creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. If we play this late game and are able to hit that 20, there's pretty much no way our opponents are winning. Downpour is 1 in a blue to tap up to 3 target creatures. Seems like a pretty reasonable spell if you got 5 mana. Tap 3 creatures, spend the 3 to make creatures, make them bigger, whatever you want to do. And Ensnare is quite unique, and I really like this card because instead of paying for this spell, you can just return 2 islands to your hand, and then you tap all creatures, which means if you are tapped out, you can still play this spell, and it has instant speed. So this makes this really, really strong. Next up, we have Fate Stitcher, Feeling of Dread, and Gideon's Lawkeeper. Fate Stitcher is really great because you can tap or untap another target permanent. So maybe if you want to activate an ability of one of your creatures again, you can untap it with that. And it has Unearth, meaning you can return it from your graveyard and then instantly tap something because it has haste. Feeling of Dread just taps 2 creatures and has a flashback, which taps another 2 creatures. And Gideon's Lawkeeper, just pay a white and tap. Gold Meadow Harrier, Hands of Binding, and Hidden Strings are next. Gold Meadow Harrier is another just pay a white and tap a target creature, but these next 2 spells are really cool and I really love them. They are Cipher spells, and there are only a few of these from the Return to Ravnica block. And how this works is you cast this spell and then you can imprint it on a creature, and whenever that creature deals combat damage, you can cast it for free. So both of these are just tap target creature an opponent controls. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. And Hidden Strings is you may tap or untap target permanent, then you may tap or untap another target permanent. Hidden Strings here is a little bit better, but if you can still cast Hands of Binding and just hit with a creature, it's going to do some work for you. Next up is Hithlian's Knot, Hylda's Crown of Winter, and Icy Blast. Hithlian's Knot is just tap target creature, scry 1, and draw a card. Seems pretty decent. Hylda's Crown of Winter is a legendary artifact from the Wilds of Eldraine that has a couple different activated abilities. First, for 1 and tap target creature. This ability costs 1 less to activate during your turn. So basically, during your turn, you can tap something for free. And then next up, for 3 mana, we can sack Hylda's Crown of Winter to draw a card for each tapped creature your opponents control. We have so many spells in this deck that just tap all creatures. This is just a huge draw spell that's basically going to put us ahead of the game. If we can play this on turn 3 and then play a spell like we already talked about, like Buster Squell, Bond of Discipline, or Cone of Cold, we can just draw maybe 10, 20 cards. You know, if our opponents are playing token decks, even more. And Icy Blast is an X in blue, tap X target creatures. Ferocious. If you control a creature with power 4 or greater, those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. Well, obviously with Hylda we make a 4/4, so this is really great. Next up we have Icy Manipulator, Minister of Impediments, and Opposition. Icy Manipulator is pretty great because we can just pay a colorless to tap a target artifact, creature, or land. We can obviously use this on a creature, but if our opponent has a pesky creature or artifact or land that we just don't want them activating, this is perfect for that. Minister of Impediment, same thing. We can just tap it to tap a target creature. And Opposition, probably one of the best enchantments and spells in this deck overall. Tap an untapped creature you control, tap target artifact, creature, or land. With Hylda's ability, you can create a creature, tap that creature, tap a creature your opponent controls, pay 1, do it again and again and again to gain some incredible value. So if you're playing against this deck or you're playing this deck, beware, this is very, very good. Next we have Plunge into Winter, Regina's Sanction, and Sleep. Plunge into Winter is tap up to 1 target creature, scry 1, then draw a card. Notably, it says tap up to 1 target creature, meaning if there isn't a creature on the board yet and we really need to scry and draw, we can still cast this spell, which is really great. Regina's Sanction is a sorcery, and for each player, choose friend or foe. Each friend puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature they control. Each foe chooses 1 untapped creatures they control, then taps the rest. Not as great as some of our other stuff, but if we want to do some politicking, this might be great. Maybe we have a counter player who would really appreciate those counters on everything. So, maybe we can work together. And Sleep is tap all creatures target player controls. Those creatures don't untap during that player's next untap step. This does limit it to just a single player, but like I said in the last one, maybe we need some politicking and say, well, I can tap down all his stuff and you swing in. And lastly, we have Turnabout and you see a guard approach. Turnabout says choose artifact, creature, or land. Tap all untapped permanents of the chosen type target player controls, or untap all tapped permanents of that type that player controls. We can choose ourselves here and untap all of our artifacts, creatures, and lands, which actually doesn't seem too bad. In the late game, 4 mana to untap all your lands seems pretty good to me. And the last card, You See a Guard Approach, is a single mana for tap a target creature or hide target creature you control, gains hexproof until end of turn. Another way to tap a creature or protect our commander. Now, before we move into that second set of cards, if you liked what you saw so far, please consider subscribing to my channel. I do these commander deck techs every week, building a new commander. It's a ton of fun. I really enjoy doing it, and I do all kinds of other content that you can see on my channel. Now let's take a look at the rest of those cards. Moving into the second round of tap cards, we have cards that all are triggered or activated abilities from ETBs or during a certain point in time. So I call these trigger to tap. And our first card is Court Street Denizen, Dream Shackle Geist, and Frost Titan. Court Street Denizen says whenever another white creature enters battlefield under control, tap target creature an opponent controls. Dream Shackle Geist, it has flying, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose up to one. Tap a target creature, or target creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. And Frost Titan says whenever Frost Titan becomes target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that spell unless its controller pays 2. And whenever Frost Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, tap target permanent. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. You can kind of see what I'm going for here. These are tap things that are going to happen intermittently so that you're not having to pay for or choose when to tap your creature to tap stuff. It's just going to happen as the game goes on and on. Next up, we have Gladwig the Wizened, Githari Monk, and Greatsword of Tyr. Gladwig the Wizened says when it enters the battlefield, you draw X cards. And whenever you cast a blue spell, tap target non-land permanent in opponent control. We're going to be casting a lot of blue spells, so that seems pretty great. Githzara Monk has Flash Flying and Psychic Defense. When it enters the battlefield, tap all creatures you don't control. This could probably be pretty good during a pre-combat main phase of one of your opponents who's about to swing into you. Just instant speed, tap all their stuff, and get a creature on the board. And Greatsword of Tyr is one of my favorite commons from Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate, because whenever a equipped creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and tap up to one target creature the defending player controls. It's really good in the early game because you can equip it for a single white, and if your opponent only has one creature on the board, you can just tap it and swing right through. Hammers of Moradin, Ice Rot Sentry, and Junkwinder are next. And Hammers of Moradin are dwarf clerics with Myriad, meaning whenever this creature attacks for each opponent other than the defending player, you may create a token that's a copy of it, and it gets sacked at the end of combat. But when it attacks for each opponent, tap up to one target creature that player controls. Seems pretty good to me. Next up is Ice Rot Sentry. This is a new one and says when it attacks, you may pay 1 in a blue. When you do, tap a target creature. And whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, it gets +2/+1 until end of turn. This is not just with its ability, but whenever you do. So basically, if you cast one of those giant tap all creatures, whenever you tap a creature, not whenever you tap one or more creatures, it's going to get +2/+1. So if you tap 5 creatures, it gets +10/+5, which seems like a pretty good way to end a game if you can just tap, I don't know, 10, 20 creatures to swing in for a ton of damage. And Junkwinder is a really cool card that has an affinity for tokens, which is even better because we make tokens with our commander. But whenever a token enters the battlefield under your control, tap target non-land permanent your opponent's control. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. This is just an insane way to tap several creatures and just get some amazing amount of value. Junkwinder is one of my least favorite cards to play against because of how strong it is, but in a deck like this, I understand why to include it. Next up, we have Lawsonar Captain, Niblis of Frost, and Niblis of the Urn. Lawsonar Captain says, whenever it or a human enters the battlefield under your control, tap target creature an opponent controls. And at the beginning of your upkeep, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. This card activates itself, and we have a lot of humans in this deck, so it's going to work out pretty well. Niblis of Frost has prowess, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, tap target creature an opponent controls, and that creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. All of those cantrips we went through already are going to pay off real big here. And Niblis of the Urn has whenever it attacks, you may tap a creature, so you can tap something an opponent you're attacking has, or not. Maybe somebody else has a big creature that you don't want them swinging your way. Our next 3 cards are Ojutai Exemplars, Retreat to Coralhelm, and Scroll of Isildur. Ojutai Exemplars says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose one. Tap a target creature, it gains first strike and lifelink, or exile it and then return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. This is going to help us out. Just continue to tap some stuff. Retreat to Coralhelm is going to activate on landfall, which we were hoping to get probably 1 per turn, right? So whenever a land enters the battlefield under control, you can either tap or untap a target creature and scry 1. And Scroll of Isildur says 1, gain control of up to 1 target artifact for as long as you control Scroll of Isildur. The ring tempts you. 2, tap up to 2 target creatures, then put a stun counter on each of them. And 3, draw a card for each tapped creature target opponent controls. Similarly to Hylda's Crown, but this only counts for a target opponent, but we're probably going to still be able to draw a lot of cards for only 3 mana. Sentinel of the Eternal Watch, Charade of the Numbing Depths, and Solitary Sanctuary are next. And Sentinel of the Eternal Watch says at the beginning of combat on each opponent's turn, tap up to 1 creature that player controls. If we leave up some mana after we pass our turn, we can just activate this on each of our opponent's turn. Charade of the Numbing Depths is the uncommon legendary creature from the wilds of Eldraine that kind of mimics Hylda. Obviously, Hylda is mythic rare, and she is really, really good. And honestly, if you wanted to build a budget deck with this card, she would be a great co-commander, basically. Whenever Shirei of the Numbing Depths enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls, and put a stun counter on it. Whenever you tap one or more untapped creatures your opponents control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. In a Pauper commander deck, or just in a lowered power deck, that's actually pretty great. Basically, you just spend your mana every turn, tapping down someone's thing, and you get cards to refill your hand with. Solitary Sanctuary is an enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. And whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control. This is just a big payoff where it is going to be able to buff up your creatures every time you tap something. And like I said earlier, if you're playing one of those mass tap spells where you tap 10, 20 creatures, put 20 counters on a target creature you control. That's probably going to be able to remove somebody from the game. And next we have Sunblast Angel, Tempest Caller, and Time of Ice. Sunblast Angel is a creature angel with flying, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you destroy all tapped creatures. Play this in addition to one of our tap all of our opponent's stuff, and we basically clear the board, but get to keep all of our stuff. Tempest Caller says when it enters the battlefield, we get to tap all creatures target opponent controls. And Time of Ice says for Saga 1 and 2, tap target creature and opponent controls. It doesn't untap during its controller's untap step for as long as you control Time of Ice. And 3, return all tapped creatures to their owner's hands. It's possibly even stronger than some of our stuff that just keeps them tapped, because now they have to recast them all. And lastly, we have Timon, Youthful Geist, and Topplegeist. Timon, Youthful Geist has flying, and at the beginning of combat, tap up to one target creature. And Topplegeist, similarly, whenever Topplegeist enters the battlefield, you tap a creature an opponent controls. And if you have Delirium, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if there are 4 or more card types on cards in your graveyard, tap target creature that player controls. I've just listed a ton of cards that are going to be able to tap all of your opponent's stuff over and over and over again. So let's look at some other good stuff cards that are going to help you fill out the rest of your deck, protect your commander, get some additional value from tapping your creatures. So starting off, we have Arcane Signet, borrowing 100,000 arrows, and Counterspell. Arcane Signet, obviously a great mana rock, help fix your colors. Borrowing 100,000 arrows is going to draw you a card for each tapped creature target player controls, and Counterspell is going to be able to counter stuff. Next up, we have Generous Gift, Gideon's Avenger, and Ice Out. Generous Gift destroys a target permanent a player controls, which is great because white and blue don't have the best removal for some stuff, or at least I didn't put that in this deck because of our main focus, so this can be able to handle that. Gideon's Avenger says whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, put a +1/+1 counter on Gideon's Avenger. Now that doesn't say by us, so if our opponent just taps their creature to attack, he gets bigger. So this could be one of the creatures in our deck that is going to be able to deal a lot of damage. And Ice Out has Bargain, and this spell costs 1 less to cast if it was bargained, so counter target spell. We make all of those creature tokens that we can bargain, so this is actually pretty good. Next is Lightning Greaves, Mind Stone, and Palliatone Accord. Lightning Greaves gives a creature haste and shroud. Mind Stone taps to make a colorless, and we can pay 1 to sack it to draw a card. And Palliatone Accord is an enchantment that says whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, put a shield counter on it, and remove a shield counter from it to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to you this turn. Well, we can just start building those up every turn, and then if our opponent goes to swing in, maybe we can negate 20, 30 damage easily, and be able to build that back up. I really like this card. It's really unique, and I don't think it sees play in a lot of decks because it's just not super common, I guess. I don't know. First time I've seen it. Next up, we have Path to Exile, Rhoda, Geist Avenger, and Soul Ring. Path to Exile is going to remove a target creature from the game, and its controller can search for a basic land. Rhoda, Geist Avenger has Vigilance, and whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it isn't being declared as an attacker, we buff up this creature. And Soul Ring is going to tap to give us 2 mana. Swords of Plowshares, Theft of Dreams, and Thought Vessel are next. Swords of Plowshares, like Path to Exile, is going to exile a target creature, but this time its controller gains life equal to its power. Theft of Dreams says for each tapped creature your opponent has in play, you draw a card. This is going to be another one of those great draw spells, help refill our hands with a lot of good stuff. And Thought Vessel says we have no max hand size and taps for a colorless. And our last 2 cards are Virility Circle and Will Breaker. Virility Circle is an enchantment that says whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped, if it isn't being declared as an attacker, you may draw a card. This is probably one of the other best enchantments in this deck, or just cards in general, because whenever we tap something, we get to draw a card, refilling our hand instantly. And we gotta be a little careful with this. It is a May ability, but you could probably draw out your deck if you do too many tap all creature spells. So gotta be careful there. And Willbreaker says whenever a creature an opponent controls becomes tapped of a spell or ability you control, you gain control of that creature for as long as you control Willbreaker. This possibly is an even better card than your commander, kind of, because you just get to steal everything as long as this is on the board. So you're really going to want to protect this and keep this safe. And that is it. So thank you so much for watching. Hylda of the Icy Crown is such a cool commander, and I hope you thought so too. If there's a card you think I should add to this deck, please leave it in the comments down below. I would love to see it. In addition, if you want to check out this deck, I have a link to it in the description below. And if you want to help me out another way, please like and share this with your friend. Maybe you got a friend who loves playing Azorius, control. This is a great deck for them, and I would really appreciate it. Now we're going to look at today's Scryfall card of the day with Southerner Paladin. How can anyone fight so much, yet enjoy so little? The Western Paladin. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you later, Planeswalkers.